So I have a question for you regarding flood insurance. So does it vary depending on, because I know there's 100-year flood, and so there's different zones, and there's some areas that are more risk than others. So how do you typically determine that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the FEMA program has finally started to catch up to the 21st century. The private flood insurance for the last probably 5, 6, 7 years that they've been very dominant in the insurance space. They used topical mapping, and they use satellite mapping to place where the house is, but then also they can look at the satellite view of the topographical area to know how the water flows when there is a flooding event. And so then they base it off of that. So you might be next door to somebody and be paying a significantly different rate based on how the water's projected to flow through that area. FEMA traditionally would use just like they had their grid of flood zones. So there's an AE flood zone, and these are still applicable. The AE flood zone, the A flood zone, AO, and then C and X are the most common ones. X flood zone would mean that it's a low risk, and then the lender would not require you to carry flood insurance. Technically, everybody's in a flood zone. It's just how risky is the flood zone.
Right.
The AE and the A flood zones are the flood zones that the carrier or the mortgage companies are going to require you to have flood insurance. So if you fall inside of that, then traditionally FEMA would make you go get and you can still do this, you go get a elevation certificate, which measures the base flood elevation for your area and then measures what your elevation of your house is in comparison to that. And it's not bad. It's worked well for years, but the topographical mapping definitely makes a more accurate rating because they can see, there's contours that even though you might be at base flood level, but because of the way the land around you is contoured, you're probably not going to get flooded, so it reduces your rates. And then we've had other people that they were elevated, but because of where they fell in that, they were actually being charged more because they're in the pathway of the floodwaters. So all those things play into effect where you're going to have somebody in the same neighborhood could have very different rates of their flood insurance. And each carrier rates slightly different as well. So when I was talking about those private carriers, so when we do flood insurance now, we usually rate it out with about 4 carriers. That gives us a pretty good spread of who is charging what for what risk. And one of those carriers we look at is always the FEMA one as well. So that way you can kind of go, okay, which one makes the most sense? And then what coverages are important to you, because that's going to affect which carrier you want as well. Because if you want a good package, you might have to go with a different carrier, even though it's more expensive. So there's a lot of different very unique and nuanced differences between the rating systems and the coverages, but they make big difference when there's a claim. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I know when I'm working with buyers and they are looking in flood areas, I always recommend getting a flood certification if you want to put an offer during that feasibility timeline to check that out, so you know how often it floods. It's all predicted.
Right. It's prediction. But that's a really good point too, because the current homeowner may not carry flood insurance. And maybe they were before it was in a flood zone X and their mortgage company didn't require it, but now it's been rezoned because FEMA goes through and rezones every few years. And so it could be that now it's been rezoned to an AE, and you will be required, and that could add an extra $100 a month to the cost of the home to have to carry flood insurance.
Exactly. And also it could be reduced, and as you said, FEMA changes. They do the same thing with wetlands. So, you go in and you buy property, there might be wetlands on the property and things start drying up and then they disappear. And it's very common. And then they reevaluate the property and discover that that's no longer a wetland area, which is kind of nice.